I want to invite you now into seeing Pentecost fresh this year, because we are living right now in a moment when breath and fire, two central themes in the Pentecost story, are central once again to our lives. So forget what you know about the Pentecost story as best you can. Put aside the next details of the story that you know are coming because you've heard the story told year after year. And let your imagination, your wonder, lead you into the story anew with fresh eyes and ears for what the sacred story holds for us. It all begins with an inexplicable event. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. And suddenly, from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues, as of fire, appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each one of them. Justo Gonzalez, who has companioned us through this study of Acts with his own commentary, says that if we read these verses in order as one who doesn't know what comes next, the dramatic nature of the narrative becomes clear. The disciples and all of the other followers of Jesus alongside them are together when a sonic blast like a violent wind begins. And it was so loud that it filled the entirety of the house where they were gathered. And fire appeared among them, resting on each one of them. And at this point in the narrative, there is no sense of what could be happening here. There is no precedent for what they are experiencing. It is new, loud, frightening, and surprising. A sound like the rush of a violent wind has become for us, friends, the sound like the rush of an angry and grieving crowd filling the streets of our cities, tear-gassed and pelted with rubber bullets by the police, but undeterred, returning night after night to the streets. And fire. We watch buildings burn in Minneapolis and hear so many white people criticizing the destruction and the rioting. And yet, when we turn to the sacred text, everything is on fire, and we barely notice it. The disciples on the day of Pentecost are aflame. Moses encountered the divine on holy ground before a bush that was on fire. The author of Hebrews unforgettably names God as a consuming fire. In the book of Revelation, fire permeates the apocalyptic narrative of final recompense. And all the while, white America has its eyes angrily transfixed on burning businesses and the destruction of private property, because we have collectively worshiped at the altar of the market, unconcerned with what God's consuming fire desires to destroy, so that good news can grow in its place. And now we feel the rush and the fire that we have denied is from God. And then, in the narrative, is the explanation. After the sound like the rush of a violent wind and the descent of fire upon each one of them, no explanation, and obviously, as we'll see in a few minutes, no understanding of what exactly is taking place here. But the reader gets to know, and soon they will all begin to understand. The text says, all of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. They didn't know it would be like this. They couldn't have anticipated the overwhelm of the moment that was upon them. They had no idea whatsoever that the sound of the violent wind and the descending fire was the Spirit coming upon them. And then they began speaking in other languages, not speaking in the same language, mind you, but speaking in other languages. The Spirit always shows up in surprising and overwhelming ways that transgress the boundaries of race and gender and sexuality and nationality and religion. And in this very foundational text of the church, the Spirit transgresses the boundary of language, not by homogenizing, but by producing a pluriformity of tongues. Willie Jennings calls this passage the epicenter of the revolution. And it begins with two elements, breath and fire, before moving directly into a boundary transgressing pluriformity of speech. This week, breath has become the central element of another moment of the Spirit among us. The stolen breath of George Floyd instigated what has, by all accounts, the markings of another revolutionary moment. When Minneapolis police engaged in a 9-minute torture execution of George Floyd as bystanders begged them just to let him breathe, they knew that they were killing him. Everyone in that moment knew. The officer who asked if they should turn him over on his side knew. The officer who insisted that they keep him on his stomach with a knee in his neck knew. The community that surrounded him and stood up for him knew. George Floyd knew that they were killing him. I can't breathe. I want to make this connection between breath and spirit as clear to you as possible. Theological inquiry into the subject of the Holy Spirit is called pneumatology. That prefix, pneuma, is the Greek word for breath. It is a word, as Ashton Crawley puts it, connected to the invisible world of the intangible, but also the material and animation. And it is the word that the New Testament writers use to describe the Spirit. In the Hebrew Bible, the equivalent word for the Spirit, which also meant breath, was ruach. It was the ruach of God that hovered over the waters in the formlessness and void of Genesis 1. A wind, a breath from God swept over the face of the waters. Breath and spirit are bound together in the biblical text. They all heard the sound of a violent wind as they gathered together in one place. They all knew George Floyd's breath was being taken from him. He was being executed. But what no one knew in Acts or in Minneapolis is just exactly that in-between moment when breath becomes spirit, and spirit becomes fire, and a revolutionary moment begins. And then the miracle of the text happens. Because everything up to this point is an inexplicable event. The strange, loud, sudden, new, and frightening, without any sense of what is happening. And then there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem. And at the sound, the crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all of these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we, each of us, hears in our own native language?" In our own languages, we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power. Now, we sometimes confuse this speaking of the people at Pentecost in the languages of every nation with the speaking in tongues that Paul describes in some of his letters. This glossolalia is one in which an unknown language is spoken through a person by the Spirit and interpreted by someone else. And it is very important for you to understand this text, to know that this is not what is being described here. It is not the glossolalia of Paul's letters. It is people speaking in a pluriformity of known languages, spoken languages from all over the surrounding world. But they are being spoken by Galileans who didn't know or speak these languages. And they were being understood by people from every nation under heaven who were in Jerusalem that day. And that, even more than the sound of the violent rushing wind, is what suddenly arrested everyone's attention. And their response to this miracle was bewilderment and amazement and astonishment. They could hear God's deeds of power being iterated in their own tongues by men who were from the country. People who were considered bumpkins in a sophisticated city like Jerusalem. Yet here they were, speaking every language under heaven, so that all of those gathered that day in Jerusalem could understand and could be drawn into the miracle of revolution that was taking place before their eyes. And finally, there is a moral to this story that is very easy to miss if you don't move slowly from one detail to the next and really understand what is unfolding here. The sound of a violent rushing wind, fire upon all of them, simple people speaking God's deeds of power in the world's multitudes of languages, bewilderment of those who are suddenly able to understand in their own language the miracle that is taking place. And then this. But others sneered and said, "They are filled with new wine. They are drunk." Gonzalez says of this text, not all perceive what seems to be an obvious miracle. Not all perceive what seems to be an obvious miracle. Have you ever wondered why? Why are there people in this text who don't hear these multitude of languages being spoken and recognize that something incredible is happening among them? Listen to what Gonzalez says about this text. How is it that some, instead of perceiving a miracle, see only something to mock? Probably because those who sneer speak the language of the country, because they expect to understand whatever is said. The very fact that they now understood is no cause for wonder. If I expect my language to be spoken, how could I be surprised when I understand what is said? Do you get what he's saying here, friends? The people who sneer and mock and can't perceive the miracle because they are the people who are always at home. They are the ones who are advantaged by being always on their own turf. When someone speaks, they always expect to understand. When they heard folks speaking in a multitude of languages, including their own, it was simply no big deal because they always understood what was spoken on their own home turf. So for them, the miracle of Pentecost is entirely lost. Gonzalez calls this the disadvantage of the advantaged. And you know as well as I do that white Americans are always on their own home turf. The language of empire is our mother tongue. We collectively are the ones who are most apt to miss just what is going on in our midst at this moment. We have worshiped for too long at the altar of capitalism and served as ministers of the marketplace and desired the accumulation of private property more than the consuming fire of God. It is clear in how so many good white people interpret the sound of a violent wind and the descent of fire upon us today. Even as I prepared this sermon, a white gay minister whose own life has benefited from the movement of a riotous crowd who set fire to a bar with police still inside it at Stonewall, looked around at what is happening, and all he could see was property destruction and looting, focusing on the methods of protests and not the movement of the Spirit toward the boundary transgressing revolution. He looked at the news from the comfort of his home and said, "What a pathetic way of thinking." And what it sounded like to my ears when I read that statement was this: others sneered and said, "They are filled with new wine. They are drunk." The disadvantage of the advantaged. When the breath of God begins to move and the fire of the Spirit starts to descend, we don't perceive the miracle. At Pentecost, the revolution of the Jesus movement exploded. But I want you to understand this really clearly because it's important for us to get it if we are going to be caught up in a moment of revolution. At Pentecost, the revolution began and exploded in that moment. But the fiery beginning was only the beginning. It was not the movement. The breath and the fire and the boundary transgressing speech were the miracle that only some could perceive. And it came with a call that they were each to answer, to be witnesses to a new way. Pentecost was the beginning. But the rest of the book of Acts is the story of the movement building. And friends, if you've been reading that book for the last 2 months alongside me, you know that the movement building from that moment of Pentecost was hard and full of violence and the destruction of the faithful at the hands of the empire. The powers of the empire will revolt against the Spirit's movement because they have everything to lose. And white Americans who are comfortably at home in the empire's embrace, who speak the language of empire as our native tongue, may very well miss the miracle of the Spirit's movement and call. So when you pray, "Come, Holy Spirit," this Pentecost, you need to know just exactly what you are asking for. And pay very close attention to what is happening around you so that you don't miss the miracle.